Okay. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome. I'm Lias Mhanna, and I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown. I'm very pleased to be chairing this panel conversation dedicated to a volume recently published by University of Edinburgh Press entitled Resisting Far-Right Politics in the Middle East and Europe, which was edited by Tunay Altay, Katharina Galor, and Nadje Al-Ali. The volume provides an empirically grounded exploration of different case studies on anti-LGBTQ and anti-gender mobilizations of the far right in Europe and the Middle East. This is a topic that is sadly so relevant in our present circumstances, which I'm sure we'll get into during the Q&A. I think I can say that, right? Am I allowed to recognize the obvious? Okay. Each of our panelists will speak for 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll move to an open discussion. Let me introduce our panelists. Tunay Altay is a postdoctoral researcher in sociology and gender studies at Humboldt University, Berlin. He specializes in queer migration and sexual politics in the context of Europe and the Middle East. By following queer feminist methodologies, he focuses on the experiences of migrant sex workers, drag performers, and LGBTQ activists, and how they navigate social exclusion and marginalization in Europe. Nadje Al-Ali is Robert Family Professor of International Studies and Professor of Anthropology and Middle East Studies at Brown University, and the former director of the Center for Middle East Studies. Her main research interests revolve around feminist activism and gendered mobilization. Her publications include Iraqi Women, Untold Stories from 1948 to the Present, Secularism, Gender, and the State in the Middle East, and jointly with Denise Candiotti and Catherine Spellman-Poots, Gender, Governance, and Islam. Katharina Galor is the Hirschfeld Senior Lecturer of Judaic Studies at Brown University. She specializes in the visual and material culture of Israel-Palestine with a focus on gender studies. She is the author of Finding Jerusalem, Archaeology Between Science and Ideology, and Jewish Women, Between Conformity and Agency. And finally, Elizabeth Berman holds an MA degree in transdisciplinary gender studies from the Humboldt University in Berlin, and BA degrees in German studies and the history of art and architecture from Brown. Welcome to you all.
Thank you, Elias, for the introduction. Thank you, Nadia and Barbara, for organizing the book launch. So it's a pleasure to introduce this volume to you today. This edited volume represents not just a collection of ideas, but a shared journey and friendship shaped by 4 years of collaboration. So now I'm going to give you a short introduction about what happened in the 4 years. So originally what initiated this project was a 2-day digital conference we held in September 2021 titled Queer Feminist Perspectives on Political Homophobia and Anti-Feminism in the Middle East and Europe. So the conference was the outcome of a collaboration between Brown University, Humboldt University of Berlin, and Heinrich Böll Foundation, and was designed to provide a platform for not only academics but also activists and artists to discuss the rising influence of far-right politics in the regions. Our discussions during the conference refined our ideas and inspired us to continue the project in the form of a book. So now let's think about the relevance and the potential contribution of the volume. Over the past 4 years of working on this project, we have all witnessed profound escalating humanitarian crises and social upheavals. Both the Middle East and Europe have experienced the increasing presence of political constituencies that drove on nationalism, populism, religious and conservative familialism, while attacking minorities and marginalized groups. These challenges have encouraged many researchers to focus on the far right as a set of politics aiming to promote and reinstall race, gender, and sexual hierarchies, and to strip marginalized groups of their rights and protection in the process. However, the knowledge production on the far right have shown that far-right ideologies are commonly perceived as being confined to specific regions, often drawing a line between Europe and the Middle East. While some forms of far-right politics are culturalized and seen as regional in the Middle East, such as homophobia, they are often treated as exceptional to an otherwise democratic and modern political system in Europe, like Marine Le Pen being the exception in France and AfD being the exception in Germany. But we know that far-right politics are larger than far-right political parties, with many seemingly centrist, liberal, and even left-wing political figures playing a major role in its mainstreaming. Our work in the past 4 years have shown that far-right politics in Europe and in the Middle East are becoming increasingly tied to each other. Ideas of Europe or Europeanization are being promoted as degeneracy and neo-imperialism in the Middle East to discredit and challenge discussions on human rights, gender equality, and LGBTQ rights. On the other hand, homo-nationalist discourses are often employed to marginalize and criminalize migrant communities in Europe, while European far-right politics simultaneously intensifies its use of anti-gender discourses to target academia and LGBTQ activism. In this new formation, the link between gender, sexuality, and far-right politics could be seen, as Deniz Kandil suggests, as an opportunistic alliance, where anti-gender and anti-LGBTQ agendas serve as a unifying ideology to bring together groups with otherwise different goals and expectations. So in this conjuncture, we draw inspiration from queer and feminist movements and activism that actively respond to and resist these attacks across different regions. We situate queer feminist critique in this volume as a toolbox for a radical rethinking of social relations, re-evaluating normative axioms and knowledge claims, and dismantling essentialist and exclusionary conventions, while inspiring research from the margins. I will now hand over to my co-editor Nadje Al-Ali, who will delve deeper into the context of this project and far-right politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Tunay. So some of you already know that I'm on sabbatical this year, and my fantasy had been for quite a while to spend at least part of my sabbatical teaching at Baghdad University. So I'm half Iraqi, and it's always been my dream to do that. And I actually went to Iraq last January just to kind of check it out, and I thought, I think I can do it, it feels safe. But shortly afterwards, the Iraqi government basically outlawed the use of the term gender. As a gender studies scholar, that is not a good thing for me. I mean, but that's beside the point what it is for me. It is, of course, tragic for women's rights activists, feminists, gender studies scholars, and women more broadly. So in August 2023, the Iraqi Communications and Media Commission ordered all journalists, academics, NGOs, including feminist activists, to stop using the term gender. It also instructed everyone that the term homosexuality be replaced with the term sexual deviance. And initially, an Iraqi government official indicated that fines may be introduced, and later on in April 2024, an amendment to legislation included the death penalty as punishment for homosexuality. Now, this specific legislation and regulations have been the latest in a series of events and developments since the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. So at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, the prominent Iraqi Shia cleric Muqtada as-Sadr, who you see here, blamed the Iraqi LGBTQ community for causing the coronavirus. On his Twitter page, he stated that, I quote, "One of the most appalling things that have caused this epidemic is the legislation of same-sex marriage, calling on all governments to repeal this law immediately." Since then, members of armed militias, including those loyal to the Shia cleric, have been targeting anyone perceived to be gay or trans. At the same time, Muqtada al-Sadr and other political and militia leaders in Iraq have played an important role in increasing gender-based violence and challenging discourses around women's rights and gender equality. So I would say, and I've argued that in previous publications, that since 2003, there has been an erosion of women's rights, and feminist activists and academics have been increasingly under attack. And gender has been associated with obscenity and seen as a Western imposition, forcing many activists and academics to go underground or leave the country. Now, the attacks on women and LGBTQ people might appear extreme in the Iraqi context, but different levels of restrictions, discrimination, and targeting are evident in numerous other countries in the region. In Turkey, for example, in the midst of financial turmoil, under record-breaking inflation, President Tayyip Erdogan announced his plans to introduce a new constitutional referendum to protect family values against homosexual propaganda, with a law inspired by Russia's infamous 2013 so-called anti-gay law. Now, throughout the region, we have seen an uptake in various forms of anti-gender and homophobic attitudes and policies, and in our book we provide examples from Egypt, Iran, Israel, Palestine, in addition to Turkey and Iraq. Yet, it is not only in the Middle East, and that is at the heart of our argument for the book, that we have seen debates and policies becoming increasingly restricted and repressive. Anti-genderism has also intensified alongside trans and homophobia in Europe. Since the mid-2000s, anti-genderism has emerged across European countries, mainly as an opposition or manifested in the opposition to same-sex marriage or sexual education in schools. Much like the Islamist government in Turkey under Erdogan and the Russian state under Putin, the governments in Hungary, Poland, and Italy have been emphasizing the interest of traditional family to replace either individual or gender-based rights, using a nationalist discourse to discredit feminist and human rights discourses. In December 2020, and this is probably one of the most well-known examples, the Hungarian parliament passed several amendments put forward by Viktor Orban to protect heterosexual marriage. The constitution now states that a family is based on marriage and a parent-child relation. The mother is a woman, the father is a man. The new legislation includes a de facto ban on homosexual couples adopting children. Moreover, the amendments also targeted trans people by ending the legal recognition for gender self-identification and gender change, stating that a citizen's sex was determined at birth. Now, the particular strain of right-wing politics in which we are interested in the book is characterized by this shift from individual rights to a focus on traditions, religion, and the family as a basic societal unit. And we're not arguing that the emphasis on individual rights was wonderful. I mean, there was, of course, lots wrong and problematic with the kind of liberal approach. But we've seen this shift to the focus on tradition, the family as a basic societal unit, while LGBTQ rights and gender equality policies are interpreted as a new phase of global colonialism. This is really important, this idea, this colonialism, although, of course, colonial history is not at all considered in this. Now, although conservative anti-feminism and homophobia with a focus on reproductive and sexual rights has a long history, contemporary anti-genderism and political homophobia constitutes a much broader ideological construct that combines a critique of liberal value systems linked to individualism, human rights, and gender equality with an opposition to contemporary global capitalism. So that makes it really sort of quite complicated to kind of get a hold of. Now, the existing academic literature on the Middle East tends to avoid the various terms associated with right-wing populism and rather references concepts such as authoritarianism, Islamism, nationalism, sectarianism, and populism. This is partly due to the socio-political differences between the Middle East and Europe, which shape the histories and positions of power of political leaders, parties, movements, and rhetoric. Yet in our book, we use the term far-right politics broadly as an umbrella, as a way to acknowledge the fluidity and growing transregional and international overlaps between populist, right-wing, and radical right parties and extreme right movements and groups. And at the same time, we wish to underline the fact that far-right politics are not exceptional or fringe in today's world, nor are they limited to extreme right parties and political figures. Instead, far-right politics can and do appear in the demands of mainstream parties or movements. They create conditions for inequalities, discrimination, dispossession, and violence, directly or indirectly, against marginalized and underrepresented communities such as refugees, religious minority groups, sex workers, and LGBTQ people. And as I talk about this, Middle East and Europe, not comparison, but de-exceptionalizing the Middle East and also provincializing Europe, and thinking through all the different phenomena that are linked to the move to the right wing and how central gender and sexuality are. Of course, I can't keep thinking, oh my God, this is happening. I mean, how much is this central to the current state in this country? And I'm sure there will be lots of things, and there are already lots of people who have written about this. It's in the making. Now, another important issue in the study of far-right politics is the rise of right-wing populism, which combines nationalism as well as conservative and reactionary right-wing and extremist ideas with populist ideology. Right-wing populist movements, parties, and political leaders tend to pitch the people against elites, outsiders, and marginalized groups. Ultimately, in both Europe and the Middle East, right-wing politics foster fear and legitimize their policies which seek to control outsiders, whether refugees or migrants, as well as ethnic, religious, or sexual minorities, with an appeal to security. While the anti-immigration platform is more pronounced in Europe, in both regional contexts, nativism and nationalism translates into anti-minority sentiments. Now, as our book illustrates, and I'm going to finish here, the division between the Middle East and Europe is not as clear-cut in relation to the themes that we are addressing. So, one of the big aims of when we organized the workshop, but also put the book together, is precisely this idea of de-exceptionalizing the Middle East and also de-exceptionalizing Europe or provincializing Europe, depending on how you want to look at this. And I'm now going to hand over to Kati. I just want to say the book, by the way, is available open access, so you can get it online. Okay, over to you.
So I'm just going to give you a little sense of how we structured the book and our thoughts. So it's basically, the book is basically made up of 4 parts. And after our introductory chapter, part 1 provides the conceptual tools that help to engage, analyze, and ultimately resist right-wing movements in the Middle East and Europe in very different historical contexts. And while Denise Candioti and Evren Safchi offer somewhat different perspectives on how to foster dialogue and solidarity across the globe, Candioti encourages us to create new forms of feminist solidarity that go beyond the narrow-minded concerns of what she terms northern academia. And Safchi similarly recognizes the problems involved when feminists from different cultural contexts engage with each other, proposing to make room for both genuine conversation as well as for conflict or even disagreement. And then part 2 examines how political homophobia and anti-feminism are diffused into power structures and also into political processes. The first chapter is co-authored by my colleague Saed Atshan and myself, and it focuses on the Israeli state, and more on this chapter when I introduce it in a little while. Marina Shevtsova's chapter focuses on the Ukraine and on the debate surrounding sexuality education in schools. And these debates are between activists and civil society organizations who call for a comprehensive sexuality education, while conservative and religious groups oppose these efforts. And this dynamic, as Shevtsova ably affirms, is similar in many ways to what we also see in several of the neighboring countries, including, of course, in Hungary, Poland, and Moldova. And finally, Elizabeth Berman's chapter center stages France and Germany, and no need for me to elaborate on this chapter, as we have the great fortune to have her with us today to introduce her chapter. And then part 3 more explicitly establishes the transnational connections between the Middle East and Europe, highlighting both similarities and differences. Nir Sinem Kourou and Victoria Scheyer analyze and compare how right-wing parties in both Turkey and Germany engage in anti-gender and LGBTQ discourses, and how this has weakened democratic processes with some really interesting overlaps and also parallels. And Ahmed Awadallah surprises us, actually no less, with their comparative study, placing Cairo and Berlin at the center of their analysis, focusing on different, but again, ultimately similar phenomenon of structural homophobia in both contexts. And the final comparative study in part 3 is by Hakan Sandal Wilson, who moves between Ireland and Turkey, focusing on LGBTI plus and queer activism, with an emphasis on Kurdish community. And our final section, part 4, examines bottom-up, that is civil society and activist mobilizations against homophobic and anti-feminist discourses and legislation in 2 very different political contexts. Tomasz Kitlinski and Paweł Leskowicz have done a really wonderful job at explicating the power of artivism in Poland to resist the country's illiberal democracy. Firuzeh Farvadin shows how women in Iran have been resisting anti-gender politics and also the disciplining of feminized bodies through the obligatory wearing of the hijab, a topic that has been at the forefront of local and international debates and also media coverage. And if I were to summarize the structure of the entire volume in just one sentence, I would emphasize that while parts 1, 2, and 3 focus on the harsh realities and inherent problems of anti-genderism, homophobia, and the far right, the contributions in part 4 offer some hopeful tools and strategies for resistance. And as the saying goes, a little light in a big sea of darkness, which is something that we desperately need in the current context. And perhaps to conclude our introductory remarks with just one final thought. While this volume addresses much darkness, unpacking and analyzing the difficult realities that we wake up to each morning, realities that in many places seem to be worsening, not only in the Middle East and Europe, We have aimed through this dialogue between theory and activism, scholarship and practice to offer tools and directions for resistance. Thank you so much, and I'm not sure if we're making room for some questions now or moving on to the chapter chapter summaries.
Chapter summary.
Chapter summaries. So I'll take this. I'll continue right with the chapter I co-authored with Syed Atshan, and I will very briefly introduce some of the main thoughts and points we formulated in our co-authored chapter on the rise of Israeli far-right politics, queer feminist analysis, and I should remind you that we all wrote those chapters 4 years ago, and things have, it seems so incredibly outdated, everything we wrote, whether it was on Iran or on Poland, on Germany, on France, but I think what is interesting is that when we go back to 4 years ago, all the signs were there. The fertile ground for what we're seeing today was already in place. So we basically introduce our chapter by laying out the principles of Zionism and how this movement or ideology has shaped the laws, norms, and discourses on gender, feminism, and virility since the late 19th century and through to present times, that is the time we wrote the paper. And so even though Zionism has been defined by social democratic principles, the ambiguous role of religion has compromised both principles. And while there have always been progressive movements and discourses related to gender and sexuality, these have been increasingly countered by theocratic, nationalist, and right-wing voices and policies, including misogynist and homophobic expressions and regulations, intertwined with a colonial thought and praxis that defines Israel's relationship to the Palestinian people. Women in the early Zionist movement are a good example of these countering forces, which are at once progressive and conservative, at times ultra-conservative and not infrequently fundamentalist, and increasingly so as we move into the 21st century. Israel and the Zionist movements take a lot of pride in that women started to vote as early as the late 19th century, and thus were ahead of many contemporary movements and countries at the time in this respect. Within the context of the Israeli government, however, women's civic status of mothers and wives has always been closely regulated by Jewish Orthodox law, which defines their roles according to strictly patriarchal norms. Other than the growing interest in the convergence or the lack thereof of Zionism and feminism, critical research on gender and Zionism has equally focused on the movement's ideological concepts and expressions of hyper-masculinity, illustrated here with a photo from 1935 featuring a Jewish boxer, illustrating the importance of physical strength in the context of Zionist ideology. The boxer we see here incarnates this very notion of the new Jew, the muscular Jew, in contrast to the image of the diaspora Jew, one who is typically seen as weak, passive, or intellectual. And closely linked to the concept of political Zionism, and in particular to the idea of a Jewish state, is the question of demography. Following the founding of the State of Israel, one of the principal goals was to attract as many Jews as possible to establish a Jewish majority at the expense of Palestinian Christians and Muslims. And this policy was enacted in the 1950 Law of Return, and is of course understood as directly linked to the persecution and murder of millions of Jews during the Holocaust. And here illustrated by concentration camp survivors who arrived in Haifa just before the passage of the law. Now, in contrast, Palestinians were systematically denied the right to return to their homes after Israel was established. Many were killed, displaced, and the Israeli government enacted laws that prevented Palestinian refugees and their descendants from returning to the land that became Israel, creating, among others, the Palestinian refugee population and one of the largest humanitarian catastrophes. And here, directly linked to the question of demography is the issue of assisted reproductive technologies. It should perhaps not come as a surprise that Israeli society has the highest rates of ART interventions in the world, as well as the highest per capita consumption rate of infertility therapy. The political goal of controlling the country's demography can be summarized by what former Prime Minister Ehud Barak described in 2000 as an existential question, or as Benjamin Netanyahu put in his book on fighting terrorism, the most immediate and dangerous threat to the future of the Jewish state is the demographic threat. In Israel, personal status and family law are tightly controlled by the Orthodox rabbinate, despite the fact that close to half of the country's Jewish population is secular. And on this photo, we see the Almay members of the rabbinical court ruling on a comatose husband's divorce case. According to Orthodox law enshrined in the 1953 rabbinical court's law, only men have the power to terminate a marriage. Since Orthodox law treats marriage as a property relationship, with the husband being the owner and having the exclusive voice on whether to grant a divorce. The Orthodox hold on marriage and divorce not only impacts women, but also LGBTQ plus people and those who identify as Jewish but are not recognized as such. And here a case that highlights the difficulty of the state to at once increase the Jewish presence, but put the decision of who qualifies as a real Jew into the hands of the Orthodox rabbinate. In 2020, Artem Dolgopyat was celebrated as an Israeli hero when he won the gold medal at the Summer Olympics in gymnastics. And while there was much pride in the country about his athletic contributions, he was not allowed to marry his Jewish fiancée. In other words, Orthodox control over marriage and divorce can restrict the rights of women, men, and LGBTQ plus when it comes to matters that relate to personal status law, marriage, and divorce. In December 2022, Israel's then newly elected government, described as the most right-wing in its history, marked a shift as radical forces moved from the opposition to hold key positions. This coalition, including ultra-nationalist and homophobic factions, has been pushing policies that significantly affect women and LGBTQ communities. For instance, the ultra-Orthodox and religious Zionism parties are advocating for gender segregation and blocking Israel from joining the Istanbul Convention to combat violence against women. And one prominent example is Bezalel Smotrich, the current finance minister, a proud homophobe who promotes anti-feminist and anti-queer politics. The photo shows the so-called Beast Parade he organized in 2006, where his supporters are shown parading goats and donkeys. It was meant as a response to left-wing activists who wished to stage a local pride parade in Jerusalem. And the idea behind it was to mock the participants of the Jerusalem Pride Parade by equating them with animals, furthering the dehumanizing rhetoric often used by homophobic groups to denigrate LGBTQ plus people. And in a rare moment of agreement, Palestinian Muslim clerics and activists of the ruling Fatah party joined their homophobic Jewish brethren in condemning the Jerusalem Pride event, calling it a moral massacre. And another photo highlighting similar or related values, we see here an election campaign billboard reading, "Israel chooses to be normal," from 2019. Avigdor Maoz, leader of the far-right Noam party, argued that the LGBTQ community is imposing its agenda on Israeli society, which he believes should prioritize traditional family values. The rise of far-right politics in Israel continues, of course, to marginalize Palestinians, both in Israel and the occupied territories, with laws like the 2000 nation-state law further rendering Palestinian communities invisible. We know that Palestinians, seen as a demographic threat, face systemic discrimination and violence, while the Israeli government pushes for ethnic cleansing and land annexation. This also holds true for Palestinian citizens of Israel, who, despite having voting rights, remain a powerless minority in a state that prioritizes Jewish citizens. Yet, internal disagreement among various Palestinian politicians regarding women and LGBTQ rights has recently caused the dissolution of the so-called Joint List, a hopeful moment of strength and coalition among various Palestinian politicians. Mansour Abbas, shown here on the far right of the image and also of the political spectrum, objected to feminist ideas as advocated by Palestinian Israeli politicians Hanin Zoabi and Aida Tuma Suleiman, and preferred to abandon this short moment of political influence, preferring to support instead the idea of forming a coalition with Benjamin Netanyahu. In conclusion, I would like to reference scholar Rederick Ferguson, whose queer of color critique has shaped, among others, the theoretical framework for our co-authored chapter. Ferguson's work explores how militarism, capitalism, and racism intersect to disproportionately affect communities of color, offering a lens through which to understand the complex dynamics of gender, sexuality, and state power. And to wrap it up, far-right politics in Israel not only fuel discrimination against Palestinians, but also create rifts within feminist and queer communities. While Israel might project a liberal image globally, its politics around demographics and patriarchy really show how gender, race, and sexuality are all tied up in shaping the country's identity, making it hard for intersectional resistance to make headway. Thank you, and Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and to the organizers and to the editors, especially for all of your hard work these past 3.5 years. So I'll speak as briefly as I can about my contribution to the book and elaborate as well a bit on how it speaks to developments since 2021 in French, German, and American academies and also political landscapes. The citations that provide evidence for my claims, I am leaving out to keep my remarks brief, but I do read them closely in the chapter itself. So the point of departure for my chapter is the intensifying rhetoric denouncing post-colonial scholarship in France and Germany in the early 2020s, both from politicians like centrist French President Emmanuel Macron, as well as members of the far-right Alternative für Deutschland party in Germany, as well as the public, including a lot of liberal pundits. In each case, denunciations of certain critical theories in universities furnish anti-Muslim sentiment and blur the boundaries between the illiberal far right, the far left, and the purportedly more respectable political center. In France, post-colonial theory has been linked to the dubious charge of Islamic leftism, Islamo-gauchisme, with officials insisting that anti-colonial thought is incompatible with French secularism or laïcité. And in Germany, post-colonial theory is repeatedly denounced as structurally anti-Jewish, that's a quote, or anti-Semitic, echoing charges of, quote, imported anti-Semitism in a country that seeks to see itself as having successfully atoned for the Shoah, a moral society that no longer needs to feel guilt, nor accommodate those who are considered at odds with this raison d'etre of the state, that is, persons who are Muslim, Arab, or both. My examination of these recent and very much ongoing attacks on post-colonial theory and theorists, which of course intersect with similar movements in the United States, connects to feminist concerns both thematically and methodologically. Beyond the constitutive historical construction of gender and race, and all of the sexual politics of racism that play out in far-right conspiracies about a great replacement, and notably that far-right conspiracy migrates to conversations about sort of the taking over of academia by studies of identity. Oppositions to post-colonial theory follow logics already sedimented by assaults on gender studies. These discourses also reveal, though, the degree to which certain feminisms can prop up proclamations of Western supremacy, feminationalism, homonationalism. What Alain Badiou calls misguided feminists often spearhead the charge against post-colonial scholarship. My focus on the censorship of these scholarly fields in the secular context of France and Germany affords an examination of actors that self-consciously distance themselves from the Christian right wing, which has and continues to denounce gender studies as incompatible with Christian nationalist familialism. Scholars of gender, sexuality, and racialization in secular contexts might instead be considered to be improperly scientific. Methodologically, a key point my chapter aims to get across is that what might be called a queer feminist approach is unyieldingly questioning. The scholars that address sexuality, gender, post-colonial conditions, and related concerns overwhelmingly historicize and deconstruct questions around identity. It's not simply that there's some consistent theory of identity operating on two sides, one far-right and white supremacist, and the other pluralistic and liberatory. Instead, the critical theoretical work that scholars are doing overwhelmingly aims to unsettle the very terms of shored-up identity that were invented by white supremacists, who are now, of course, the ones blaming theorists of gender, sexuality, and racialization for conjuring those identities into existence. So, in other words, as I put it in the chapter, for detractors of critical theories of identity, it's a concept dragged into the social world by those who seek to deconstruct it as if they didn't exist prior to those critiques. So in attending specifically to the university and academia as a site of contestation, and not the realms of, say, immigration legislation or healthcare that might perhaps be more immediately endangering of minoritized subjects, there's an uncomfortable tension to sit with. The university is, of course, a site of very much consolidated state power, and particularly in this country of corporate wealth. But it also historically affords complex discourse and exchange about issues of identity. Critical theories of colonialism and gender are of course, not a monolith. There are ongoing and lively internal debates among critical theorists that aim to tease out the continuities and discontinuities between class struggle, queer theory, and studies of gender, sexuality, and racialization. It is crucial that scholars be recognized in the ways they allow their students to break down stereotypes rather than reinforcing them, encouraging critical thinking rather than mandating what is correct. Assaults on critical studies of identity in France and Germany nevertheless often insist that they have a totalitarian impulse. In the chapter, I consider how delegitimizations of post-colonial studies, specifically as both far left and far right, blur the boundaries of any strictly dichotomous political rhetoric, and even witness far-right actors such as the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, taking up historically left-wing imagery and discourse, for example, from the May 1968 student protests. Positioning themselves as the heir to all critiques of the status quo, critics of identity scholarship rhetorically distance their claims from Christian conservatism, outright fascism, or neo-Nazism. Following the queer feminist approach outlined above, these unexpected alliances between liberal centrist and far-right actors and their concerns over the maintenance of what they call freedom reveal the mutable boundaries of these political categories and sort of the leaking of far-right discourse into what we might consider liberal thought. In right-wing German media, for instance, studies of gender, sexuality, and race are described as totalitarian, or in the words of a member of the AfD, a late victory for the DDR, or German Democratic Republic, East Germany. Commentators seize on generational memory of communism in Europe, and particularly here in former East Germany, to construct some sort of imaginary backslide in state governance. At the same time, more centrist rhetoric links critical theories of identity to Nazism itself, deflecting attention from the fascistic and far-right resonances of such calls for censorship. The dangerous links drawn between Nazism and contemporary studies of racism carries obviously particular heft in Germany, emerging from a false equation drawn between naming and studying race as a multidimensional social construct and the devising of a totalitarian system that commits genocide on its basis. These concerted efforts to situate gender and postcolonial studies on the far left and the far right take recourse then to horseshoe theory, a widely discredited concept that argues that the far left and far right are closer to each other than either is to the center, distributed on a political spectrum shaped like a horseshoe. The model is beloved among centrists. By assessing comparable proportions of evil in fascist and communist politics, which is already a highly questionable claim, it constructs the only respectable political position to be the maintenance of the status quo, which is a conservative impulse by definition. Those who decry the place of gender studies and postcolonial theory in French and German universities furthermore cast scholars working in these fields as feeling and not thinking subjects, unable to achieve proper scientificness or Wissenschaftlichkeit, kind of untranslatable word given its capacious definition of science in Germany. While decrying affective investment in one's field of study as incompatible with scholarly precepts, certainly also a questionable claim in its own right, this rhetoric is itself highly emotional. It follows the structure of a moral panic. The French and German assaults on scholarship concerning identity reproduce, according to their own definitions, the very scientific transgressions of which they accuse gender and postcolonial studies scholars. They express a moralizing and emotional critique of their opponents. In the words of the former French Minister of Education, Frédéric Vidal, Islamo-gauchisme doesn't have a scientific definition, but it corresponds to a feeling. The view of a properly secular society as sober and rational plays a role here, particularly in justifying Islamophobia. Islamo-leftism hauntingly resonates with the concept of Judeo-Bolshevism, a pan-European conspiracy theory dating to the 1920s. Efforts to cast anti-Muslim racism and anti-Semitism as incomparable racisms, particularly in Germany, are achieved largely through coding the other, here the Arab, Muslim, or scholar of postcolonialism, as the sole contemporary perpetrator of anti-Semitism. There's that imported anti-Semitism concept. This rhetoric is a key instrument in the redemptive construction of Western European state as beyond its anti-Semitic past, as well as in the project of delegitimizing postcolonial theory. And this plays out in, actual cancellations of events constantly in Germany. German institutions have been swift to censor critiques of Israel, calling postcolonial theory structurally anti-Semitic, an accusation that emerges from an equation of Jewishness with the state of Israel and with critiques of the Israeli state with a will to destroy it. And in this, the premise that such criticism of Israel is a structural element of postcolonial thought itself. Historicizing the attempted censorship of postcolonial theory is, I hope, itself a means of complicating this charge of anti-Semitism, one that has only become intensified since October 7th, 2023, and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Denunciations of postcolonial scholarship are reminiscent of both the early 20th century moral panic, anti-Semitic moral panic around Judeo-Bolshevism, and McCarthyist purges of Marxist and often Jewish scholars from American universities in the 1960s. Casting postcolonial or anti-imperial criticism as anti-Jewish serves only to obfuscate these historical resonances and impede solidarities between Jews and postcolonial subjects and scholars. As in other contributions in this volume, I take up a transnational perspective to demonstrate that methodological nationalism simply won't work as a frame of analysis. Much historicist work in queer and feminist studies tells us that institutions, polities, and subjects are shaped by their unique situatedness in their times and places, and that comparisons therefore construct false universalisms. Without entirely dismissing this incredibly important ethics and methodology, it's also striking that repressive and anti-theory forces cloak censorship of what are seen to be American ideas by calling for analyses that are specific to European national histories and policies alone. While it would seem self-evident that exported theory from the United States is just another instantiation of American encroachment that considers, from a nation that considers itself to speak for all, it's also the case that rejecting imported theory serves the isolationist impulse to see one's nation as bounded and impermeable cornerstone of far-right movements. Such isolationism ignores the complex historical and ideological entanglements between the US and Europe, as well as the mutual influence of far-right movements across the Atlantic. Just yesterday, the German government allied with the Alternative for Deutschland party to pass incredibly restrictive immigration policy that proposes turning asylum seekers and other migrants back at the border. This happened a week after Elon Musk spoke on behalf of the party. Today, as in today, on this day, as the Trump administration rolls out repressive legislation at a dizzying speed, we obviously see similar or even intensified rhetoric in the United States that corresponds to what I've laid out here. These repressive forces coalesce around what they're calling DEI, which has become a kind of master signifier that has no clear definition anymore, but is wielded as an avatar for the wokeness that the far right or center right, increasingly the center, wants to destroy. As I note in the chapter, this is a strategy that allows the right wing to bill itself as the party of freedom in terms of free speech, while carrying out actual material restrictions on various civil liberties, including freedom of speech and thought in institutions of teaching, research, and learning. Already in 1936, German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin argued that the cornerstone of fascism is this derangement of freedom. Bear with me. He wrote, "Fascism attempts to organize the newly proletarianized masses while leaving intact the property relations which they strive to abolish. It sees its salvation in granting expression to the masses, but on no account granting them rights. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them expression in keeping these relations unchanged. The logical outcome of fascism is an aestheticizing of political life." So the attacks on DEI are achieving precisely this aim. Legislators and politicians can refuse to attend to the property relations and material conditions that affect the vast majority of the population in favor of doling out more anemic freedoms, for instance, the freedom to deploy hate speech on social media. Addressing the global far right as a movement with a history and leaking boundaries between the illiberal and the respectable is unfortunately all the more exigent right now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you all for 5 fascinating contributions to the conversation, and thank you all for sticking to the 10-minute deadline. And now we have time for about 35 minutes of discussion, so I'll moderate. So we'll have a microphone floating around.
Just your cue to ask the first question.
I think I'm going to wait. I see some energy.
Thank you all. Congratulations. The last section is two separate chapters. Do you feel like there were other examples from your own research and other hope-inducing movements that are happening that didn't make it to the book, but that you could tell us about?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So actually what we did was we published a digital dossier before the book, knowing that academic books often takes forever to publish. So that's why you can actually access shorter versions of some of the chapters and some additional chapters online on Henry Poe's website. But I think in each chapter, of course, the authors responded to this question. I mean, it wasn't only about describing how homophobia or anti-feminism is being formed by far-right constituencies, but also talking about what people are doing. Maybe it's not always seen as artivism, as it was clear in the case of Poland, but I think resistance can take different shapes, right? I mean.
Yeah, so to my mind, I think that queer feminist activism in its various shape and forms has really been at the forefront of challenging authoritarianism in many contexts. So I think actually Turkey is one example, although of course there has been sort of a crackdown. But I also feel, so we have one contribution by Ahmed Awadallah that looks comparatively at Berlin and Cairo. And I guess to my mind, I mean, I used to work on feminism in Cairo in the 90s. And at the time, I was struck by the fact that Egyptian feminists, by and large, were quite homophobic, if not outwardly, but strategically so, because they were already under attack of being Western to Western. And I do think that the new generation of feminists, not just in Egypt, but across the region, is not so much concerned with that idea. And there is much more of a kind of coming together of queer activism and feminist activism, and also challenging the idea that feminism or queer activism is imposed from outside. I do feel there has been a real shift. So the younger generation would say, well, we don't need a Western feminist to tell us about gender-based inequalities. We have a long history starting from the beginning of the 20th century of Egyptian feminist activism. So to my mind, that is actually quite hopeful. And also when you look at the various protest movements in the region, I mean, you know, in Lebanon, also I'm thinking more recently in Iraq, where especially young people protested against corruption, against authoritarianism. I mean, there was not, well, in Lebanon, I think there was a more explicit space for queer feminism. In Iraq, there is not. But at least there was some space for feminist voices. So I do think there is some hope. Yeah, but, you know, generally it doesn't look so good. It's an understatement.
Yeah, Nancy.
Hi, thank you all for presenting this volume. I look forward to delving into the chapters. And I guess I have a question about terminology and the usefulness of certain labels, given the strangeness of the fact that in one orientation, and usually in secular contexts, it's the far right versus the far left. But the principles that are associated with the far left are also associated with a tolerance for Islam and sort of decolonial discourse, which seem more in line, and those are seen as the enemy of the far right in the US. So it's kind of, if it's not a horseshoe, it's a weird parabola or some kind of Ouroboros. I don't know what a better term is, right? In the sense that folks who are opposed in one context are allies in another, but disavow that allyship, right? So the far right in the US would never say we are aligned with Islamic fundamentalists, but when it comes to the things that they oppose, they seem very much on the same page, right? So I guess I wonder about the usefulness of these terms, which are kind of orientations around centers that aren't holding. And so what is a different way of conceiving of this set of values that seems to underlie the impulses that we see in multiple contexts? And you know, if not horseshoe theory, what is the role of reactionary centrism in kind of enabling this kind of mutability of across contexts? I'm sorry if that's unclear. I'm trying to kind of figure it out as I ask the question, but it really is about how these categories have these kind of implicit orientations that don't seem to map the reality any longer. And in which case, what might be a better replacement for describing the tendencies that we're seeing?
Thank you so much. Absolutely, this terminology is insufficient and suggests all sorts of distances that don't actually exist, right? And I think the horseshoe does beautifully illustrate reactionary centrism, as you so correctly call it. This idea that, if you move too far in either direction, then, everything becomes the same. And I think that I'm not sure what a different kind of topography would look like, but I think the reactionary centrism betrays its own centrism, of course, in trying to conserve things as they are, and also these equations drawn between the far left and the far right are in many ways apologies for fascism, apologies for the far right, and kinds of discussions of histories in like the former Eastern Bloc in Europe that are just factually incorrect. And you see this in Germany a lot with scholars, historians of the Holocaust and of Stalinism who really draw lines of equation. I mean, I visited a concentration camp that said, well, look, here are the barracks where, many were murdered, but you should know that the Soviets used these as well, and that was really, really bad too. And he was like, what? So I think that has sort of been folded in, like this sort of politics of memory around East Germany, around the Soviet Union, in Germany specifically, has been used as kind of a way of dampening, tamping down conversations about the far right and the dangers of fascist resurgence. But absolutely, I mean, there are so many alliances that are disavowed. And it's complicated because I want to point out the alliances without supporting the existence of this horseshoe, right? That is effectively like anti-extremist. I think extreme circumstances call for big ideas and not just sort of centrist maintenance of the status quo. So thank you. I don't know if that answered any of what you said, but thanks.
Hi, Nadje. Congratulations to everyone. I had a question for Nadje. I was interested in what you said about the banning of certain terms in Iraq, and I was wondering, was that just kind of immediately enacted, or were there forms of resistance to that? Were people choosing new terms? What's happening in response to that?
It's been going on for a while. I mean, ironically, the feminist activists and academics I've been talking to said we had more space to talk about gender-based equality and sort of feminist issues at the height of sectarian violence following the invasion of Iraq in 2005, 2006. It was not safe to go out on the street for us, but we could talk about it publicly. And in fact, at the time, I mean, until I would say a few years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, across the political spectrum, whether it was more secular-oriented politicians or whether it was Islamists, they would use gender as a way to generate funds. I mean, they were in conversation with UN-led organizations. And I mean, I know I was interviewing a number of conservative Islamist women who were trying to get funding for their project on education of girls. I mean, this were very sort of, what should I say? I mean, conservative ideas about women's empowerment, or you had conservative women politicians who would try to get money from conservative funding organizations in the state for women's empowerment, to create women business women, this kind of stuff. So, but it is really over the last 5 or 6 years, maybe following the protest movement in Iraq 2019, 2020, where you had mainly young Shia who were against sectarianism, lots of women on the street, and there was a kind of sense we need to crack down, we need to try to control it. Personally, I think it has a lot to do with Iran as well, because the current government, which is a mainly Shia Islamist government that is closely aligned with Iran, and given the women life freedom movement in Iran and the, I guess, challenge to authoritarianism in Iran, I think that's a kind of preemptive move. I'm not answering your question, but I'm just giving you a bit of a history. So this has been going on for a while. It started actually in Iraqi Kurdistan a few years ago. And there, I know a colleague of mine who started gender studies at the American University in Sulaymaniyah had to step down. Initially, she tried to sort of resist, but when she got some death threats, she decided to step down from her position. Now she's working again, but not gender studies. I mean, she's doing English literature. Initially, feminist activists sort of tried to find ways around it. Now that's kind of what they're doing right now. They're not using the term gender. They're trying to work around it, but it's also very new. And there is, I don't know if you know, but this is just the tip of the iceberg, because just a few days ago, the Iraqi parliament passed new legislation that has been in the making for years now and has been protested against by Iraqi women and men inside and outside. But this new legislation, which is the Jafari law, basically would allow individual Shia authorities, Islamic authorities, to allow girls as young as 9 years old to get married. And so this is a real blow to women's rights and gender-based equality in Iraq, where there was a personal status quo governing marriage, divorce, and child custody since '59 that was quite egalitarian in the past. And now this is, like a big shift. So in many ways that is of greater concern, but of course the two are linked.
What was the minimum age of marriage?
9 years old. Before 18.
18.
Yeah. I mean, but before, of course, there were young women who were married before 18, sort of under the radar. But now this is legalized, right?
I have a question. So one thing that we've heard a lot, or a kind of discourse that we heard a lot in the build-up to the U.S., the most recent presidential election, among Democratic strategists was, like people like James Carville and others, basically was kind of along the lines of the Democrats or liberals in this country have a problem insofar as like it's so often like the liberal causes or progressive causes are so often presented as a kind of package deal. Like you have to accept everything. You have to accept left-wing or liberal views on labor, on race, and then also on gender and sexuality and queer issues, on trans rights and so on. And the discourse or the critique by these strategists was typically, that Democrats would do well to disaggregate this. Like you shouldn't be selling it this way. That someone can be a committed liberal or a progressive when it comes to matters of labor, right? And that is a sort of a mainstream thing. That's something that everybody can get behind. And you have much better electoral success if you can really push these large, wide bore issues and not focus on the things that a lot of people, who would otherwise be attracted to your cause, may be alienated from, specifically gender, right? So I'm curious whether this particular discourse also appears in these other contexts. And Kati, you alluded to this when you talked about the coalition problem in Israel. I wonder if it was a similar kind of issue that led to the fragmentation of that coalition, and whether we see similar things elsewhere.
Yeah, in this particular example, yes, and no other example comes to my mind, but the opposite comes to my mind, which is that the right wing often tries to use as if queer politicians as a fig leaf for right-wing politics. For example, trying to come up with some example, well, in Israel, the Knesset speaker was openly gay, the first openly gay Knesset speaker, but advocating for conservative rights, or women like Giorgia Meloni or Le Pen in France. Being women.
Yes.
And then in Germany also, we have the example of Alice
Weidel.
Weidel, who represents the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, the most right-wing party, and she's openly lesbian, and so they're trying to use this as a fig leaf for right-wing politics. But in the other direction, I'm not sure.
Yeah. So actually, Philip Ayub was one of the keynote speakers of the conference we organized in 2021. And he talked about, he writes about how European accession actually impacts different countries, like legislations, especially when it comes to LGBTQ equality, how the idea of being part of the European Union can positively impact countries, like approach to different minorities. And at the same time, now we can see that like European Union can actually pressure, maybe partly like Hungary or some other countries who are, or Poland, who are planning to maybe like pass legislations targeting different minority groups again. So we are seeing this type of organizations can have an impact, like especially when it comes to protecting queer and trans people.
Can I go ahead? Okay. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting kind of debate that's come to the fore in the wake of the election results, and I think in my view, the centrality of issues around sex and gender in the Democratic campaign is like a fiction imposed from the outside. Like, it was the right wing that was kind of obsessively pushing that, whereas the Democrats, were never actually really all that liberatory, and we're not really mentioning it. And this idea of like the package deal, I do wonder if structurally it is different in the US because we have this sort of like messianic winner-take-all system where, every new administration comes and changes everything completely. But the question of like disaggregating issues around sex and gender, one that the Republicans are obsessed with is trans girls in sports. And it's this really familiar kind of fascistic obsession with the child and the censorship of books in schools, et cetera. But I don't know if those can be separated from issues of labor, which also presupposes that the Democrats really care about labor, which I'm not sure that they do. But if the family, immigration, reproduction, like these are central to issues around labor. And I think it's the anti-reproductive sort of trans body that I think poses a real threat to the Republicans. It allows them to kind of like hold up LGBTQ issues as this monstrous thing that must be squashed. So I don't know. I've thought a lot about it in the wake of it, but I think it's been a real kind of scapegoat for the Democrats to assess their own failed campaign.
Maybe just one more point to add, which is tragically on the other side, on the sort of far right spectrum from center to illiberal to far right, is that the way that gender and sexuality is used, as we say, we state, or think Denise Caniotti states, as a glue. Very divergent strands of the right are being held together by this focus on gender and sexuality. And so this is actually, one of the many ways that the right manages to assume some unity and strength, while the left, of course, is suffering from lots of fragmentation.
All right. Any other? Yes, Michael.
So I'm still interested in the vocabulary question, and I'm wondering if in the past few years, since the book has been done, and also in view of some of the new circumstances we're all facing in various places, pardon me, if we can play a kind of experiment, a kind of game, are there any new jargons or vocabularies that you're thinking about that you might want to just place into circulation to get over some of these issues of the kind of tiredness of old terms? I mean, I have no trouble myself with right wing because I think it's a reliable marker and it has a long history. I have much more trouble with left wing, which is a sort of preferred term of the New York Times, for example. Let's call it reactionary centrism, which I think is a very good addition. I put that one as on the list of new terms. The politics of moral panic is one that I found kind of helpful recently, which has a great deal to do with gender and sexuality issues, but also moves into other areas. So that's my question. Are there any candidates for a kind of experimental terminology that might kind of loosen some of these old boundaries?
I'm not sure, but the one that comes to mind, although it's now sort of a few years old, but I really think it's very useful, is this idea of masculinist restoration, which sort of replaces the idea of patriarchy as usual. And this has emerged in a context where patriarchy as usual is no longer really valid because it has been challenged from so many sides, from so many directions. So has heteronormativity. But what we see then is this masculinist restoration, which is the attempt to, with all means and maybe even more violent means than before, try to hold on to masculinist patriarchal power. And this term emerged in the context of protest movements in the Arab world, where we've seen sort of new forms of gender-based violence at the hands of states and militias. And I think that I find this term useful because I feel like you can almost sort of attach it to various other constellations. I mean, that is being hopeful, but sometimes I do think that what we see is a kind of so I could say, like in the Middle East, it's maybe sectarianism that has been attacked, and so when we see kind of sectarian forces, it's a kind of a restoration attempt. I want to think, but this is me being super, super optimistic and hopeful, that what we see in this country and elsewhere in terms of the rise of far-right fascist governments is a kind of trying to restore, so the equivalent of masculinist restoration. But certainly in terms of gender and patriarchy, I think I find that a useful term.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the question of terminology is really interesting, and I know I think history really plays a role in why I felt comfortable using the terms far left and far right, in terms of, these are not concepts that correspond to a stable reality, as is the case with language as such, right? But it really means something to a German audience, for instance, to conjure the fears associated with the repressive structure of the Eastern German government. And so I think there's something to be said for deploying terms that are legible and that have a history in this way. But again, I mean, I absolutely agree that they're not sufficient, and that there are all these, I mean, in American discourse especially, the difference between liberal and left wing, I mean, those terms are just thrown around as if they're the same, which is absolutely not the case. So I think, and I sort of touched on this, but the concept of freedom, I mean, that's a much larger sort of political, philosophical project. But, what is liberalism? What is neoliberalism? What kinds of freedoms are we talking about here? So everybody wants to stake their claim on being, the ones for freedom, including freedom from having to deal with people in society that you don't want to deal with on the far right. But yeah, I think that's what I have, yeah.
Okay, we have 2 more questions.
Hi, I wanted to ask about the Persian women life freedom movement, and particularly how it feels that the movement, this genuine sort of movement for liberation of Iranian women, has kind of been imaged in the West and kind of co-opted by right-wing forces in the West as kind of they are kind of using this image of Iranian women protesting as sort of more anti-Islamic or anti just things to support their sort of agenda, while it feels like the left wing in the West has not really been engaging with or just being involved with this issue as much as they should have for how big this movement has been and how much media attention it has received. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that within the context of like European Western politics and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we were closely following the protest while we were drafting the introduction. I'm based in Berlin, and Nadje was here, obviously, in Providence. So in Berlin, there were many protests supporting the activists, some organized by the diasporic groups, but at the same time, some organized by different political parties in Germany. And I wasn't surprised, but it was a very emerging theme that some conservative German politicians would show the protests happening in Iran as an example that Islam is like an oppressive religion, and therefore we have to stop like pro-Islam activists from taking place in German mainstream media. So even there were some tweets posted by politicians saying, "Hey, look at what's happening in Iran!" And we have like these academics and activists, as like Elizabeth mentioned, like promoting Islam in Germany, kind of like saying that the only liberation is basically either secularization or integration to German values, which is defined solely by Christianity or Christian secularism. So yeah, this was, that's why we are starting the introduction with this vignette showing how still like whatever's happening in the Middle East is shaping discussion in Europe. As a researcher working on migration, this was very clear to me, but also as someone who moved from Turkey to Germany, the link was very clear to me. And I think also in the introduction, we all shared our life stories and our research interest, and how this kind of like this transnational lens was very kind of like obvious to us, but still in the way that the research was structured, especially in far-right politics, we didn't see many work bringing together the two regions. So that's why that was definitely one of the main interventions that we tried to do with the book.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about sort of the idea that the left was not taking it up. I did feel that both, I didn't follow closely Germany, but I know in the US and also the UK, lots of feminists were in solidarity. I think what I noticed though, that of course there's a large Iranian diaspora, and the Iranian diaspora is very polarized around this issue of either trying to, unfortunately it's this polarized position, either trying to challenge Islamophobia and racism and being advocating against sanctions on Iran and sort of military intervention, or pointing out that patriarchy, the oppressive Islamism is responsible for gender-based inequalities. there are some who are kind of trying to straddle both. I mean, I noticed that more than sort of lack of attention, certainly amongst feminists.
Okay, one more question, Shara. And
Thanks. I want to thank you all very much for what I take as an invitation and provocation at the same time. So the invitation is that we can get beyond the East-West binary by looking at how on a particular sort of axis there is a meeting point between right-wing forces on both sides. I saw that especially in the paper by Kari and Saad Atshan. On the other hand, there's a provocation, which is that this kind of description of meeting points ask us to destabilize the very categories that we use, the vocabulary issue that I think was raised. Because obviously it's not, they have genealogies that are very different. So we can take, for example, Layla Ahmed's work about gender in Islam and see it as a kind of a defensive posture, where she says, look at Lord Cromer, as this sort of mega colonial figure, every speech he gave was about women and gender rights, and how this distinguishes East from West. Whereas at home, he was the head of the anti-suffragist society and was completely against women's rights. So there's a particular genealogy to colonial discourse about gender. And there's other genealogies at play here. And I think the discomfort that I felt in the questions about the vocabulary is that the genealogies were all European. There was nothing here about sort of indigenous or Islamic or other kinds of genealogies of these categories that one could use to talk about this issue. And so that I think in a way fits with Michael's question about, okay, what other concepts, what other words, what other genealogies can we look to understand this issue better than just using what's available at this point, and right, left, liberal, neoliberal, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and we've been thinking about this, and we think that is, as you say, it's an invitation to think with us, and it's a next step. For us, it was important at this point. The individual chapters that are certainly the chapters that empirically based on the Middle East go more into the specific trajectories of political concepts, and also the way that gender and sexuality is being used. But of course, we hope that this sort of opens up, discussion and debate. We felt that at this point, it was maybe politically more strategic and tactically important to, I guess, address a Western audience. Not only a Western audience, but to try to show to the idea of de-exceptionalizing the Middle East with using the term far left that we thought, would address or bridge these bodies of literature that usually don't speak to each other. But we, when we talked about it, we are aware of the limitations in terms of the trajectory of the term. And certainly myself, I very much hope that this is going to be taken up, and I don't know if not by us, by others.
Yeah, maybe this provocation was easier for us to take because I'm not a far right theorist, or I don't necessarily work on far right politics, because obviously, I sometimes attend to Europeanist conferences. I'm a migration studies scholar. I know Turkey, I know Germany. And I think in the States, Nadje, Kati, you attend to Middle East studies conferences. So it's partly also about how, what type of research that we are kind of exposed to. Whenever I attend to Europeanist conferences, I always see at least I don't know, 6, 7 panels on anti-genderism in Europe. They always compare France to Germany, France to Austria, Austria to Germany, all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, okay, that's great, but what is so specific about this context? Why can't we think about the Middle East? Why can't we think about other regions? Like, why can't we talk about Turkey and Germany and compare AfD and AKP? But still, it's also partly about how we structure academia, which affects our intellectual labor as well. So this was definitely provocative for us to come up with the umbrella term and say, hey, let's call it far right, and then let's try to think with that. But yeah, maybe partly it may cause some reductionist readings of the specific histories that we are trying to cover. But I guess that's also like the goal of that volume. I mean, we are covering many countries, and obviously they all have their own context. But hopefully with this provocation, maybe people can agree or disagree with us, but still we welcome whatever opinion.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a really important question, I think. I mean, I'll echo Tunay. I'm study Europe. It's my background. I think critically examining something is not the same as endorsing it, but certainly the risk of kind of holding it up as some kind of universal standard is there. I thought about this, and I think I've witnessed, or I'm sympathetic to theorists who have spoken about the instrumentalization of non-Western language and concepts as sort of an almost empty gesture of decolonization. You know, when it comes as sort of a punctuation mark, like, here's my analysis, but now I'm using this term. Somebody was speaking about Edouard Glissant's opacity and transparency and saying, you know, I'm so sick of hearing white scholars hold up opacity as if it's this kind of key to getting past some kind of hegemonic modern regime of racial visibility or whatever. And I do think about that, you know, about not wanting to do that and not being myself in a position where I know enough about it to do that without it being a kind of empty gesture.
But what I find interesting is that I'm having this book launch in the States, and we had 2 book launches in Germany before this. And like obviously, like arriving here after the elections, I like got the sense that now we are meaning that here the audience is like in the search of a new vocabulary, new word, new concept, because it is as if we lack words, we lack concepts. I mean, we have them, but obviously, I guess this is partly a collective feeling that we are in search of something, a key, that would kind of unlock whatever's happening right now, unlock the things that we cannot explain with words. But maybe we need some patience, maybe we need to revisit the things that we know. Maybe the answer is not a new concept, but things that we already have. So, yeah. You have something to say?
I think we need to let some of the staff off the hook so we can just thank the panel once again.
Thank you.